Margaret Ellison stood on the platform of the small countryside station, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper bag of chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the tiny station bakery. The sun filtered through scattered clouds, painting long shadows over the faded wooden benches and rusting railings. She smiled to herself, thinking of how much little Eva loved these cookies. It was her idea, after all, to surprise her granddaughter with something sweet for the journey. The train stood silently in wait, hissing gently like a resting beast, and the air smelled faintly of steel and dust. Margaret was 60, with silver threads elegantly streaked through her chestnut hair, and a graceful but worn look that came only from years of endurance. She had worn her best pale blue cardigan and matching skirt that morning, neatly ironed and soft to the touch. She wanted to look nice, not out of vanity, but because this trip had meant something to her. A rare getaway with her family, her son Nathan, his wife Claire, and their daughter Eva. It had been Claire's idea to visit her parents in the coastal town of Fairmore, and Margaret had been thrilled when they invited her along. She hadn't traveled in years. The idea of sharing stories with Eva during the train ride, playing travel games, and looking out the window together brought her joy she hadn't felt in a long time. She walked briskly back toward the carriage where they had been seated just 10 minutes earlier. Her steps quickened when she noticed the train doors were closed. That seemed odd. She had only stepped away briefly. As she approached the window, she spotted Nathan seated beside Claire. Eva was perched on Claire's lap, eating a cracker and humming to herself. Margaret knocked lightly on the window, smiling and lifting the bag of cookies in her hand to show them. Claire's eyes met hers for a fleeting second before she turned away. Nathan didn't look up. Margaret's heart fluttered uncomfortably in her chest. The platform attendant called out, "Last call, doors are sealed," and signaled the driver. With a gentle jolt, the train began to move. Margaret's smile froze. She broke into a small run, waving and shouting, "Nathan, I'm here. Wait, please." Her voice cracked, her lungs struggling against the rising panic. Eva turned and waved, smiling innocently. Claire merely adjusted her sunglasses. Nathan looked up just once, then looked away. The train moved steadily forward, leaving a trail of dust and stunned silence in its wake. Margaret slowed, then stopped, her hands still outstretched, the bag of cookies crushed against her chest. The station seemed to fall eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant rattle of the disappearing train wheels. She stood motionless for a few minutes, disbelief washing over her in waves. It didn't make sense. It had to be a mistake. Maybe Nathan thought she had boarded another compartment. Maybe Claire didn't see her waving. Maybe, and then the truth began to settle. A cold, slow, creeping realization that chilled her from the inside out. They had left her. Not forgotten. Left. Her legs trembled, and she sank onto the nearest bench, trying to gather her breath, her thoughts, her composure. Around her, the world carried on indifferently. A young couple laughed while taking selfies. An old man read a newspaper across the tracks. The station master disappeared into his office without noticing the woman who had just been emotionally sucked by her own flesh and blood. Margaret reached into her purse, her phone gone. She remembered now. Nathan had asked for it earlier, saying he needed to install a new travel app. He never gave it back. She checked for her wallet. It was there, but only a small amount of cash. Her cards. She had handed those to Claire 2 days ago to help book the hotel. She had trusted them completely. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of strangers. She sat up straighter and folded the paper bag of cookies neatly, placing it beside her. She watched the tracks, empty now, wondering how far away they had gotten, and if Eva would even notice she was gone. The bitterness of the moment tasted stronger than betrayal. It tasted like erasure. Margaret wasn't just discarded. She had been silently deleted from their lives, an inconvenience gently pushed away. And the worst part, it wasn't impulsive. It was planned. Her missing phone, the silence in Claire's eyes, the sudden train departure. It had all been orchestrated like a cruel play. She stood up shakily and approached the station counter. The young clerk behind the desk barely looked up. "Next train's not for 3 hours, ma'am, and that one's headed back west, not to Fairmore." Margaret's voice wavered. "Do you have a phone I could use? It's an emergency." The boy handed her a dusty landline and pointed to a small corner booth. She dialed Nathan's number. From memory, It rang. Once, twice, then voicemail. She tried again. No answer. Again. Nothing. She tried Claire's number. The line went dead after one ring. No one wanted to talk to her. No one was coming back. Margaret leaned against the booth wall and let the silence hold her. Not just the absence of noise, but the heavy, echoing silence of abandonment. 1,000 thoughts fought for attention, confusion, anger, sorrow, humiliation. But beneath them all was something steadier, fiercer, the raw ember of pride. She had raised Nathan as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident, worked 2 jobs, sacrificed everything to ensure he had a good education, clean clothes, a warm meal every day. She had gone without winter coats so he could have new books, skipped doctor's appointments for herself so he could afford basketball camp, and this is what she meant to him now. Margaret exited the booth and walked slowly back toward the platform. Her mind buzzed with memories, Nathan's first steps, his high school graduation, his wedding day, how she had sewn her own dress from discount fabric just to look presentable, how she had held Eva in her arms the day she was born and whispered promises into her tiny ear. I'll always be here, sweetheart. I'll always protect you. The promises now felt like cruel jokes whispered to herself. Hours passed. She sat alone, unnoticed. The bakery closed. The benches emptied. Night crept in, painting the station in colder shades. The air turned sharp. She hugged her cardigan tighter. No coat, no phone, no family, nothing. As the cold settled into her bones, a soft voice broke the silence. Excuse me, are you all right? Margaret looked up to see a woman with warm eyes and a flashlight. The station janitor, Lucille. She offered a thermos of tea and a blanket. Margaret hesitated, then accepted it wordlessly. I seen what happened, Lucille said gently. That train, the way they left. I saw you running. I've seen a lot of sad things in this job, but that wasn't right. For the first time since the train left, Margaret felt tears escape the corners of her eyes. She wiped them, quickly, but Lucille sat beside her and let her cry without judgment. I don't know what to do, Margaret whispered. Lucille nodded. Come with me. There's a shelter near here. Warm food. Safe beds. We'll figure it out in the morning. Margaret clutched the paper bag of now crushed cookies and nodded. She stood up, legs weak but her heart beating with a strange rhythm, one she hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not fear, something older, something buried beneath years of silence and sacrifice. The beginnings of resolve. As she walked beside Lucille into the night, a thought rang clear in her mind, a single promise, not to Nathan, not to Claire, not even to Eva. To herself, you will not disappear. The next morning brought with it a quiet drizzle, the kind that seemed to wash away the heaviness of a restless night. But for Margaret Ellison, the weight remained. She awoke in a narrow but warm cot in the corner of the Haven Street Women's Shelter, tucked under a patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and something older, perhaps kindness, aged over years. The soft sounds of distant pots clanging in the kitchen and the low murmur of waking women created a lullaby of reality, gently pulling her back into the world she had hoped was just a bad dream. But the truth loomed like a fog, refusing to lift. She had not imagined the betrayal. Her son, Nathan, had truly left her at the train station. Margaret sat up slowly, her muscles stiff, her heart sore. Her cardigan was neatly folded at the foot of her bed, a silent testament to her pride even in the face of humiliation. Her feet found the cool floor, and she rubbed her arms as she glanced around the room. Women of all ages stirred from sleep, some preparing for a day of job searching, others simply preparing for survival. There were whispered prayers, muttered plans, and a silence between them all that spoke of past wounds and unseen scars. Yet, in this circle of strangers, Margaret felt the faintest tinge of belonging, the common language of having been discarded. Lucille appeared in the doorway with a steaming mug in each hand. Morning, Miss Margaret, she said with a gentle smile. Coffee's strong, just how I like it. Thought you might too. Margaret accepted the cup with both hands. Thank you, Lucille, for last night. For everything. Lucille waved her off. Ain't nothing, but I'm glad you came here. You've got that look, the kind that says you're not one to stay down for long. Margaret managed a soft laugh, though it sounded foreign to her own ears. I don't feel very strong this morning. Asterisk Lucille sat beside her, her frame solid and comforting like an old oak tree. You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be awake enough to know you're still breathing. The strength comes back, piece by piece. Asterisk Margaret sipped her coffee in silence, letting the warmth seep into her bones. She thought of Nathan, of Claire, of little Eva. The ache that twisted in her chest wasn't just betrayal, it was the death of the illusions she had clung to for years. She had excused Claire's passive-aggressiveness, ignored Nathan's growing distance, and convinced herself that Ava's fading affection was just teenage disinterest, not something passed down like a disease. Asterisk after breakfast. Lucille led Margaret to a small community room, lined with bulletin boards and folding chairs. In one corner, a white-haired man was setting up papers and a laptop. That's Thomas Rayner, Lucille said in a low voice. Retired lawyer. Comes here a couple times a week to help women get back on their feet legally. I mean, property issues, ID recovery, even small claims. He's helped a lot of ladies. Asterisk Margaret didn't know what compelled her to approach him. Maybe it was the way his glasses perched delicately at the tip of his nose, or the way his fingers moved deliberately, as if every action mattered, or maybe it was simply that she needed to talk to someone who wouldn't look at her with pity. Asterisk, excuse me, she said quietly. I was told you might be able to help me. Asterisk Thomas looked up, his expression kind but focused. Of course, I'm Thomas, and you are. Asterisk Margaret Ellison. Asterisk, he extended a hand, firm and warm. Tell me what brings you here, Margaret. Asterisk, she hesitated, the story tangled in her throat, but then, as if unspooling a ribbon knotted too tightly, she began. She told him about the station, the train, the missing phone, the wallet, the cookies she never gave to Eva. Her voice faltered when she spoke of Nathan, not from grief, but from something deeper, disbelief that her own son could orchestrate such calculated cruelty. Asterisk Thomas listened without interruption, taking the occasional note, his face unreadable. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then he asked gently, have they done this before? Left you out? Taken control of your finances? Asterisk Margaret nodded slowly. It started small. Claire insisted I give her access to my accounts to help with bills. Nathan wanted me to sign over the car, said it would be easier if everything was in his name. I thought I was helping, being a good mother. Then one day I found out that house wasn't in my name anymore. They said it was for tax reasons. Asterisk Thomas leaned back, eyes narrowing. Do you have any paperwork? Old deeds, bank statements? Asterisk, not with me. They have everything. I didn't even realize what was happening until I was already erased. Asterisk Thomas looked at her for a long moment. What they did isn't just cruel. It's illegal. Elder financial abuse, fraud, potentially abandonment of a dependent, depending on the state. If we can get proof, we can take this to court. Asterisk Margaret blinked. Court. Asterisk he nodded. You don't have to sit quietly, Margaret. You don't have to vanish because they tried to make you. The law's slow, but it's not blind. We can make noise. Asterisk the thought overwhelmed her. She had always seen the law as something for other people. People with power, lawyers, suits, and stern voices. She was just a mother, a grandmother, a woman who used to bake pies and iron school uniforms. What did she know about fighting legal battles? Asterisk, but where would I even begin? Asterisk Thomas smiled gently. Right here, with one step, I'll help you request records. We'll contact the county for title transfers. If they forged anything or coerced you, we'll find it. Asterisk Margaret felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, that was still too delicate. But maybe the roots of hope. Possibility. The idea that she wasn't as helpless as she felt. Asterisk. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, forms, and patient explanations. Lucille brought sandwiches and water. Thomas showed her how to write a declaration, to list dates and events, to piece together the slow erasure of her autonomy. Asterisk by late afternoon, she was mentally drained but strangely quick-headed. She walked alone outside the shelter, where the drizzle had stopped and the sidewalk glistened like glass. She looked up at the sky, where patches of light had started to push through the clouds. Asterisk she thought of her old house, the way she had painted the kitchen yellow because it reminded her of sunlight, Even in winter, she remembered the garden she used to keep, with lavender and marigolds and tomatoes that Eva would pick when she was little. She wondered what the house looked like now. What parts of her had they erased already? What pieces of her still remained? *A. Part of her ached to forget, to forgive, to return to a time before the betrayal, but that was gone. There was no going back to the illusion, and maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. She had been invisible in her own life for too long. For decades she had been the backdrop to other people's stories, the mother, the babysitter, the silent supporter. But now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she was holding the pen. As she re-entered the shelter, Thomas caught her eye. "You did good today, Margaret. Really good." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She didn't feel victorious, but she didn't feel defeated either. That night, as she lay in her cot staring at the ceiling, she didn't cry. She thought of her husband, gone too soon. She thought of the woman she had been at 30, fierce, loving, determined. That woman wasn't gone. She had simply been buried under years of quiet service. But now, piece by piece, she was digging herself out, and the first step had been taken. Tomorrow, she would take another. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with rays of sunlight pouring through the small window beside Margaret's cot. She blinked awake, her body still stiff, but her mind more alert than it had been in days. The events of the past 48 hours hovered in her consciousness like smoke that refused to dissipate. But this morning there was something else too, a fragile thread of direction, not hope yet, but motion. She had taken the first step yesterday, a step that had felt foreign and shaky, but it was hers. And in this small act of reclaiming agency, something within her had stirred. Lucille, ever the quiet sentinel of compassion, greeted her with a gentle smile and a bowl of warm oatmeal. "You've got a visitor, hun," she said, setting down the tray at the foot of the bed. Margaret sat up, surprised. "A visitor?" Lucille nodded toward the community room. "He said he wanted to drop something off for you. I think it might give you some peace of mind." Curious and cautious, Margaret slipped on her cardigan and stepped into the hallway, where she found Thomas Rayner seated at the same folding table from the day before. In front of him sat a small stack of photocopied documents and a manila envelope. He looked up and greeted her with a kind nod. "Morning, Margaret," he said. "I wanted to show you something." Margaret sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. Thomas passed her the top page, a scanned copy of a property deed. "Is this my house?" she asked, eyes scanning the document. "It is," Thomas replied. "Or rather, it was, and legally, it should still be. I did some digging last night. The title transfer was registered under your son's name 6 months ago. But what's troubling is that your signature on the document doesn't match your other records. I'm quite confident it was forged." Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the outline of her own name, written in an unfamiliar scrawl. "He signed it for me." "It seems that way," Thomas said gently. "Or Claire did. Either way, this is grounds for legal action, serious action. Forgery is a criminal offense, especially in property matters involving vulnerable individuals." The word vulnerable stung. Margaret didn't like the implication, but she couldn't deny its truth in the eyes of the law. She had been manipulated, her trust taken for granted, her belongings stolen with a smile. Still, the idea of accusing her son in court felt alien, like something from someone else's story. "There, my family," she whispered. "How did we get here?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice kind but firm. "Family doesn't give anyone the right to strip you of your autonomy. What they did is not just betrayal, it's abuse. You trusted them, and they used that trust to erase you. But you're not erased, Margaret. You're here. You're fighting." She stared down at the document again. A wave of memories surged through her. Christmas mornings in that house. Nathan's 7th birthday when she had decorated the entire living room with hand-cut streamers. The echo of her husband's laughter in the hallway. The scent of cinnamon she always sprinkled near the front door. She clenched her fists. "What do I do next?" Thomas smiled softly and handed her a list. "This is what we need. Your previous utility bills, or bank statements with that address, any documents proving long-term residence, and a sworn statement about your knowledge, or lack thereof, regarding the title transfer. We'll also need to file for a temporary injunction to freeze any further transactions involving the property. Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing the list like a soldier receiving orders. It was overwhelming, but it was also tangible, and tangible meant manageable. Later that day, Lucille offered to accompany her to the nearest branch of her bank to request old statements. On the bus ride there, Margaret stared out the window at the passing buildings. People, life. So many stories, so many silences behind closed doors. How many others had suffered betrayal from the ones they loved most? Lucille, sensing her thoughts, nudged her gently. You know, Margaret, I've seen a lot of women come through that shelter. You'd be surprised how many have been hurt by their own kin. It don't make it easier, but it means you're not alone. Margaret nodded. It helps more than you know. The bank clerk was sympathetic and, upon verifying her identity, printed out over a year's worth of statements, seeing her name on each monthly record, her address printed clearly in black ink. It reminded her that for a long time, she had existed, mattered, belonged. As they exited the bank, Lucille suggested they stop by a small cafe nearby. Over tea and biscuits, the two women shared more of their stories. Lucille had once been a nurse, retired early after a back injury and a failed marriage that left her with little savings and no home. She had lived in shelters herself before becoming a caretaker. I used to think I was weak for ending up where I did, Lucille confessed. But then I realized, survival takes a kind of strength no one teaches you. It's something you earn, step by step. Margaret took those words and tucked them away like a treasure. She didn't yet feel strong, but she was learning. Over the next few days, Thomas and Margaret worked like clockwork. She located old mail, insurance records, even birthday cards from Eva, with the home address scribbled on the envelope. Each scrap of paper was another puzzle piece. Margaret began to carry a notebook with her, writing down timelines, questions, memories. The more she wrote, the clearer her story became, and with clarity came power. In between legal preparations, she took quiet walks around the neighborhood surrounding the shelter. There was a small park nearby with a bench under a willow tree, and she often sat there watching children play. Sometimes she'd see a little girl with pigtails, or hear a giggle that reminded her of Eva. The ache was constant, but slowly dulling. No longer a wound, but a reminder of love she still held, even if it had been stolen from her. One afternoon, as she rested under the tree, a woman approached hesitantly. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, holding a toddler on her hip. Are you Margaret Ellison? The woman asked. Margaret looked up startled. Yes. Do I know you? The woman shifted the child in her arms and smiled shyly. I'm Tessa. I used to live across the street from you. My mom was always sick, and you brought us meals for weeks. You used to give me your old books. Margaret's heart stirred with recognition. Little Tessa Woodward, you're all grown up. Tessa beamed. I never forgot your kindness. I saw your name on a flyer at the shelter. They were looking for volunteers to help with legal cases. And I thought, it can't be the same, Mrs. Ellison. But it was. I wanted to say thank you for what you did when no one else did. The encounter left Margaret speechless. It reminded her of something Thomas had said. You are not erased. That kindness, that small act of sharing, had lasted for decades in someone's heart. Returning to the shelter that evening, she found a small note on her cot. It was from Thomas. Court appointment set for Monday. Be ready. They're not going to expect you to fight back. That's your strength. She folded the note and held it to her chest. She was afraid of facing Nathan, of seeing the coldness in Claire's eyes again, of standing in a courtroom with a trembling voice. But she was also something more than afraid. She was prepared. The next few days passed in focused silence. Margaret rehearsed her statements, reviewed her documents, and let Thomas coach her on courtroom demeanor. She practiced answering questions, learned to pause when overwhelmed, and even picked out a modest but strong outfit, a navy dress with silver buttons, one her husband had bought her years ago for an anniversary dinner. Lucille surprised her with a pair of polished shoes from the donation closet. For when you walk in like the queen you are, she said with a wink. The night before the hearing, Margaret stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She saw the wrinkles, the tired eyes, the faint scar on her chin from childhood, but she also saw a woman rebuilding herself, not from scratch, but from memory. Asterisk, she whispered to her reflection, "You're not a burden, you're not forgotten, you're not done." And for the first time in a long time, Margaret Ellison believed it. The courtroom was nestled inside a quiet brick building on the edge of town, unassuming and almost quaint. But Margaret Ellison felt its looming presence like a cathedral of judgment. She stood outside for a long moment before walking in. The air, crisp and cool, her fingers clenched around a small leather folder holding the evidence she and Thomas Rayner had spent days assembling. She had dressed carefully that morning, her navy dress with silver buttons, freshly ironed, and her husband's old watch around her wrist, a silent talisman of strength. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and her face, though lined with time, held a quiet resolve. Asterisk, inside the courthouse, everything seemed too bright and too quiet. The polished floors, the wooden pew-like benches, the murmur of legal clerks and rustling papers, it all formed a symphony of tension. Thomas met her at the entrance with his usual calm demeanor. He wore a navy suit and carried a briefcase worn from years of use. His nod was brief but encouraging. "You ready?" Asterisk, Margaret inhaled, slowly, "as I'll ever be." Asterisk, they entered the courtroom, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Sitting just a few feet ahead, on the opposite side of the room, was her son, Nathan. He wore a sharp gray suit, his hair slicked back, his expression unreadable. Claire sat beside him, clutching a tablet and whispering something in his ear. Neither of them looked toward Margaret. It was as if she didn't exist. Asterisk, the sight pierced something deep in her, but she didn't let it show. She straightened her shoulders and walked with Thomas to their table. The judge, a stern but woman in her 50s named Judge Caroline Reyes, entered soon after. The proceedings began promptly. Asterisk, the case was introduced. Elder abuse and fraud allegations involving the unlawful transfer of property from Margaret Ellison to her son, Nathan Ellison. The atmosphere shifted. Eyes turned. The weight of the room shifted from abstract tension to pointed attention. Asterisk, Thomas stood and began the opening argument. His voice was steady, respectful, and compelling. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not merely a case about property. It is a case about betrayal, trust, and the legal rights of someone whose entire life was quietly taken from her by the people she loved most. My client, Margaret Ellison, a 60-year-old widow and devoted mother, was systematically manipulated into surrendering control of her finances and her home under false pretenses. We have reason to believe the signature on the property deed was forged, and we will provide evidence to support that claim." Asterisk, Margaret sat still, her hands clasped in her lap. She focused on the rhythm of Thomas's words, letting them anchor her. When Nathan's attorney rose to speak, she felt her heartbeat quicken. His name was Richard Klein, and he spoke with the smoothness of someone who had argued dozens of these cases before. Asterisk, there is no dispute that the property now resides in Nathan Ellison's name, he said, and we maintain that the transfer was made with full consent from Mrs. Ellison. Any claims to the contrary are emotional projections, not legal truths. Asterisk, Margaret's jaw clenched. Emotional projections, was that all her life had become? Asterisk, the first witness called was Margaret herself. She rose slowly, walked to the stand, and swore the oath with a voice that barely trembled. As she sat, she scanned the courtroom once. Nathan was looking at his phone. Claire, stone-faced, never glanced her way. Asterisk, Thomas approached the stand with a reassuring nod. "Mrs. Ellison," he began, "can you tell us about the home in question? How long did you live there?" Asterisk, "I moved in with my husband after we married," Margaret said clearly. "We bought the house together. We raised our son there. I lived in that home for over 35 years. Asterisk, and during those years, was your name on the title?" Asterisk, "Yes, until 6 months ago." Asterisk, "Did you knowingly transfer the title to your son?" Asterisk, "No," Margaret replied. "He told me it was for paperwork, something about lowering taxes. He asked me to sign some documents, but I never saw a deed. Later, I found out the house wasn't mine anymore." Asterisk, "Did you sign a deed?" Asterisk, "No, not knowingly." Asterisk, Thomas then handed the judge a copy of the signature on the deed and another document signed by Margaret years earlier. The difference was clear. The signature on the deed was inconsistent. lacking the distinct swoop she always used on the EMN. Her name, asterisk, he turned back to her. Did you feel coerced at any point by your son or daughter-in-law? Asterisk, Margaret hesitated for a breath. I felt pressured, isolated. I was told it was better for the family, that I'd be taken care of. I believed them. Asterisk, did you give them access to your finances? Asterisk, yes. Claire said she could manage my bills more easily that way. I thought I was helping. Asterisk, did they ever repay that trust? Asterisk, Margaret's voice was soft but unwavering. They left me at a train station with no phone and no money. They didn't come back. That's the only answer I need. Asterisk, there was a pause in the room. A heavy, soul-splitting pause. Asterisk, when Richard Klein attempted to paint Margaret as forgetful, confused, he brought up her age, asked her about the medications she took for blood pressure and arthritis, hinted at potential lapses in memory. Asterisk, double quotes, Mrs. Ellison, he said smoothly, is it possible that you simply forgot signing the deed? Asterisk, no, she replied firmly. I forget where I left my glasses sometimes, but I don't forget handing away the only home I've ever known. Asterisk, he then asked about the bank transfers. Weren't you the one who initiated the joint account with Claire? Asterisk, I was told it would help with bills. I didn't know they were draining my account. Asterisk, he raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof they did? Asterisk, look at the statements. They're there, she said, and Thomas quickly handed over the highlighted documents. Asterisk, next. Thomas called a handwriting expert who had compared Margaret's old documents with the deed signature. The expert confirmed the high likelihood of forgery. Asterisk, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. No longer neutral, now heavy with implication. Asterisk, then came the final witness, Tessa Woodward. Now a young mother herself, who testified to Margaret's consistent mental clarity and her long-time ownership of the house. Asterisk, she was like a second mother to me, Tessa said. There's no way she would have given up that house willingly. That home was her everything. Asterisk, when testimonies concluded, both attorneys gave their final statements. Thomas focused on dignity, truth, and the need to protect those who are most vulnerable. Richard Klein, though sharp, appeared slightly deflated. The weight of the evidence had piled too high. Asterisk, Judge Reyes recessed court, stating she would render a decision in 2 days. Asterisk, as they exited the courthouse, Margaret felt like her body was made of glass, brittle, fragile, yet upright. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of impending rain. She turned to Thomas, who was quietly packing his briefcase. Asterisk, I don't know if I did well, she said. Asterisk, you did, he replied without hesitation. You told the truth. That's all that matters. Asterisk, that night, back in her cot at the shelter, Margaret lay awake. The courtroom replayed in her mind. Nathan's indifference, Claire's coldness, the moment she held the fake deed in her hand and saw how carelessly her name had been used. Erased, rewritten. Asterisk, she thought of her husband, of how he would have fought for her had he still been alive. And yet, even without him, she had stood her ground. Asterisk, she imagined Eva, older now, maybe 10 or 11, growing up in a house filled with lies. Did she know? Did she ask questions? Did she remember those cookies? Asterisk, Margaret didn't cry that night, not because the pain had gone, but because something new had taken root where the despair used to be, a fierce, pulsing clarity. Asterisk, no matter what the verdict, she had told her story, and the world had listened. Asterisk, for the first time in years, she was no longer silent, and no longer small. Asterisk, the days leading up to the court's decision were a blur for Margaret Ellison. The weight of her past and present, the anger, the sorrow, and the uncertainty, all collided in a storm of conflicting emotions. She spent hours at the shelter, quietly, reading, practicing her statement over and over, and meeting with Thomas Rayner as they refined their strategy. They had done everything right, the evidence was solid, the witnesses compelling, and Margaret's testimony had resonated with an authenticity that was undeniable. But despite all the preparation, there was still the unsettling sense of waiting, the feeling of being in limbo. Asterisk, the following morning, Thomas called. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Asterisk, Margaret, we've got the verdict. Asterisk, she felt her pulse quicken as a wave of anxiety swept over her. She had waited for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, her legs felt unsteady. Asterisk, do you want to hear it now? Thomas asked, his tone even. Asterisk, yes. Margaret whispered, I'm ready. Asterisk, Judge Reyes has ruled in your favor, he said, pausing for a beat before continuing. The deed transfer was invalid, and your son, Nathan, is required to return the property to your name. You're entitled to damages for the financial abuse and distress caused by the actions of your son and daughter. The judge also granted an injunction to prevent any further financial manipulation or transactions regarding the property. Asterisk, for a moment, Margaret could hardly breathe. The news hit her like a wave, a rush of victory mingled with disbelief. She had won. She had won against her own flesh and blood, against everything they had done to her. But at the same time, there was no elation, no celebration. There was only the sense of something profound being stripped away, the illusion of family, the comfort of what she had thought was hers. Asterisk, are you there? Thomas asked gently. Asterisk. Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'm here, she said, her voice quiet. I didn't expect this. I don't know what to say. Asterisk, there's no need to say anything, Thomas replied. This victory is yours. But you don't have to decide what to do next immediately. We'll take care of the paperwork and make sure everything is done properly. This isn't a quick fix, but it's a solid start. Asterisk, Margaret felt a slow sense of relief spreading through her body. She had fought for what was hers, and for once, the system had sided with her. But still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder what the consequences would be. How would Nathan and Claire react? What would happen when the family came face to face with her decision? Asterisk, that afternoon, she sat in the small community room at the shelter, staring out the window at the cloudy sky. There was a faint glimmer of sunlight peeking through the thick layers of clouds, but the shadows in her heart remained. Asterisk, Lucille entered quietly, her presence as comforting as always. She handed Margaret a steaming cup of tea. How did it go? Asterisk, Margaret sighed, taking a sip before replying. I won. The judge ruled in my favor. Asterisk, Lucille's face softened, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. That's good, Margaret. That's really good. I knew you had it in you. Asterisk, Margaret nodded, but the weight of the moment still clung to her. I won, but I feel ... empty, like I've lost more than I've gained. Asterisk, Lucille sat beside her, folding her hands in her lap. It's normal to feel that way. You've been through a lot, and sometimes, when you get what you fought for, it's not all joy. You've had to face a lot of truths, and that takes time to process. Asterisk, Margaret sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the years of silent sacrifice, the years of being invisible in her own life. For so long, she had been the background, the mother, the grandmother, the dutiful wife. Her own needs had been forgotten in the name of family, and she had convinced herself that it was enough. But now, it all seemed like a cruel joke. The betrayal from her son and daughter-in-law, the manipulation, the isolation, it had all shattered the world she had built. Asterisk, I didn't want to lose them, Margaret admitted softly, her eyes welling up. I didn't want to lose my family. Asterisk, Lucille's voice was gentle but firm. You didn't lose them, Margaret. They lost you. And that's not on you. What they did to you, that's not love. And sometimes, when you fight for yourself, you have to let go of the people who can't respect you, and that's the hardest part. Asterisk, Margaret nodded, the tears she had been holding back, finally falling. I don't know what to do next. Asterisk, Lucille smiled and placed a comforting hand on Margaret's arm. You take it one day at a time. You've already done the hardest part. Now, you heal, and you decide what kind of life you want moving forward. Asterisk, as the day passed, Margaret's thoughts drifted back to her house. The place that had once been her sanctuary, the place she had shared with her late husband, the place where Nathan had taken his first steps, where she had rocked Eva to sleep in the nursery. It had been the heart of her life, and now, after everything, she was taking it back. It felt like both a triumph and a funeral, a triumph for the woman she had become, and a funeral for the illusions she had clung to for so long. Asterisk, that evening, after a light dinner at the shelter, Margaret took a walk through the small neighborhood park. The air was still, and the smell of damp grass filled her lungs. As she wandered along the paths, she passed a young mother with a stroller, a couple walking their dog, and an elderly man sitting on a bench feeding pigeons. Each of them had their own story, their own lives, and for the first time, Margaret felt like part of that world. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't invisible. Asterisk, as she walked, her mind wandered back to Nathan and Claire. What would they say when the papers were served? Would they be angry? Would they try to deny everything, or would they finally see her, really see her, for the first time in years? The thought of confrontation wasn't easy. Part of her still wanted to retreat, to go back to the way things were, to live in the comforting illusion of family. But the other part of her, the part that had fought so fiercely for what was hers, knew that there was no turning back now. She had crossed a line, and that line had marked the beginning of her independence. She returned to the shelter later that night, tired but resolute. She sat in the small, dimly lit common area, reflecting on the next steps. There would be legal battles to follow. She would have to take possession of the property, deal with the emotional aftermath, and perhaps even sever ties with Nathan and Claire. But through it all, she would no longer be the invisible woman she had once been. She would no longer be a passive participant in her own life. Margaret Ellison had found her voice, and it would carry her forward into whatever came next. The following days brought new challenges, but they also brought a sense of liberation. Thomas and his team worked on the paperwork, ensuring that the legal process was handled properly. Margaret's house was slowly returned to her, but there was still much to do. Her relationship with Nathan and Claire was fractured beyond repair, and the emotional cost of everything was something she would carry with her for a long time. But through it all, Margaret knew that she had done the right thing. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her home, and that was something no one could ever take away from her. In the weeks that followed, Margaret began to settle into a new routine. She spent more time at the shelter, helping others who had been displaced or abused. She became a mentor to younger women who were in the same position she had once been in, invisible, neglected, and silenced. Her experience became a beacon of strength for others, a reminder that no matter how small or powerless one might feel, there was always a way to rise again. Margaret Ellison had learned the hard way that family was not always a source of love and support, but she had also learned that there was a world outside the walls of betrayal, a world where she could thrive, where she could rebuild, and that was the first step in her new life. The life she had always deserved. Margaret stood once again in front of the house that had been taken from her. The home where her memories were etched into every crack in the walls and every scuff on the wooden floors. But this time, she was no longer a stranger looking from the outside. She held in her hand a legal document bearing the court's seal, a formal order reinstating her as the rightful owner of the property. A court officer accompanied her, clipboard in hand, while a locksmith worked the front door with patient diligence. Claire and Nathan were not there. They had been served the notice 2 days ago and vacated the house without contest. Perhaps they thought they had already taken everything that mattered, but Margaret knew better. As the locksmith clicked the last bolt open, Margaret stepped inside. The smell was different. Her home now bore the scent of someone else's habits, expensive cologne, unfamiliar candles, and an antiseptic sterility that clashed with the warmth she remembered. The furniture was mostly gone. Claire had taken the modern pieces she'd insisted on buying after the title had been transferred. In the living room, Margaret noticed the space where her late husband's bookshelf once stood. Gone. But she didn't mourn it. She simply noticed the absence, like an old wound that had finally scarred over. She walked slowly through each room, touching the door frames, running her hand along the walls, grounding herself in the place that had once felt like a living extension of her soul. The kitchen, her favorite place, had been repainted in cold tones. She remembered when it used to be yellow, her doing bright and sunny, even on the darkest days. Now it felt sterile and hollow. The refrigerator hummed softly, a reminder that life continued, even when love didn't. Upstairs, she entered the master bedroom. The bed was gone, but the curtains she had sewn herself 2 decades ago still hung on the windows, faded but intact. A sudden surge of emotion overcame her. Not grief, not even nostalgia, but something else. A deep-seated understanding that while the objects had changed, the essence of the space still belonged to her. The walls remembered her laughter, her tears, her prayers. That couldn't be stolen. She opened the closet and saw a single cardboard box in the corner. Inside were things that must have been overlooked when Nathan and Claire packed up: an old photo album, a few of Ava's childhood drawings, and a ceramic mug Margaret had hand-painted years ago. It read "World's Best Mom" in messy blue letters. Her fingers trembled as she held it. Perhaps Claire had meant to throw it away. Perhaps Nathan had just forgotten it. Either way, it was back in her hands now. a fragile relic of a time when love was still a promise, not a weapon. After the court officer took his leave, Margaret sat in the living room floor with her back against the wall. The quiet was both peaceful and eerie. She had her house back, yes, but it was not a return to the past. It was something new. This wasn't the happy home of her married years, or the chaotic nest of young motherhood. It was something stripped down, raw, and honest, a blank canvas, bearing traces of everything she had lost, and everything she could still build. Over the next few days, Margaret began the slow process of reclaiming her space. Lucille visited and brought a small potted plant, lavender, Margaret's favorite, and a casserole that reminded her of simpler times. Thomas stopped by with a few folders, but mostly to check in on her well-being. You're doing better than most, he remarked one afternoon, as she swept the back porch. I've had practice, she replied with a half-smile. Loss teaches you how to start over, whether you want to or not. She spent long hours cleaning, scrubbing the floors, opening the windows, and letting the sunlight bathe every corner. She patched cracks in the plaster and painted over walls that held too many bad memories. She didn't try to make the house what it used to be, she simply made it hers again. In the evenings, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the world go by. Children rode their bikes past the gate. A teenage couple held hands under the street lamp. An elderly neighbor, Mr. Rosen from 2 doors down, waved to her and asked how she'd been. It was these small moments that began to root her back into the neighborhood, not as the forgotten mother, but as herself. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived. It was postmarked with no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably childish. She opened it with trembling fingers and found a folded letter written in pencil. Greater than dear Grandma, I miss you. Mommy and Daddy don't talk about you, but I remember your cookies. I remember your hugs. You told me stories and called me Sunbeam. I found this old picture of us in my box. I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye. Love, Eva. Margaret read the letter over and over, her fingers trembling. She clutched it to her chest and closed her eyes. The pain surged again, deep and sharp, but it was laced with something softer. Connection. Eva remembered. That was enough. It was more than she could have hoped for. Her granddaughter had not forgotten her warmth, her love. Maybe one day, they could rebuild something together. Brick by careful brick, motivated by the letter. Margaret made a decision. She would not just live in the house, she would thrive in it. She would transform it into a place of refuge, not just for herself, but for others. She reached out to Lucille and proposed the idea, converting her unused basement into a temporary haven for displaced women. Lucille was instantly on board. It's a beautiful idea, she said. A place built from pain, turned into healing. They spent the next few weeks planning. Margaret found purpose in the work, painting the walls, adding bunk beds, collecting supplies. Donations came from the shelter, from old neighbors, even from Thomas, who offered to draft all necessary legal paperwork pro bono. By the end of the month, her basement had been converted into a small, welcoming space with soft lighting, comfortable beds, and a bookshelf filled with Margaret's old favorites. She named the space Sunbeam Haven, in honor of Eva, in honor of second chances. One evening, after cleaning up the last bits of paint, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and looked around. The counters gleamed, her new yellow curtains fluttered in the breeze. The lavender plant thrived on the windowsill, and for the first time in years, she felt something settled inside her. Peace. The house was not a symbol of loss anymore. It was a symbol of triumph, of dignity, of resilience. Her story had been rewritten, not by the hands of betrayal, but by her own hands, steady, wrinkled, and strong. Then, as if the universe recognized her quiet completion, the doorbell rang. Standing outside was Thomas, holding a bottle of sparkling cider and 2 glasses. Thought you might want to toast your victory, he said. She laughed. I don't know about victory, but I do know about survival. He handed her a glass. Then, here's to survival. And to writing your own ending. They clinked glasses in the living room, the last rays of sunlight casting golden shadows across the freshly painted walls. Later that night, Margaret sat with Ava's letter in her lap. She wrote back, not knowing if her reply would reach her granddaughter, but needing to send it anyway. She told Eva that she loved her, that she missed her, and that her door would always be open. Asterisk, and with that, she sealed the envelope and walked it down to the mailbox herself. Asterisk, as she returned up the steps of the house that had once been stolen. Margaret paused to take it all in, the soft hum of cicadas in the air, the scent of lavender wafting from the window, and the knowledge that, no matter what came next, she had come home not just in body, but in spirit. Asterisk, this wasn't the end of the story, it was the turning point. Asterisk, she wasn't just a mother, or a grandmother, or a woman who had been wronged. She was Margaret Ellison, and she had returned, not in defeat, but in power. Margaret Ellison's home had slowly transformed from a space once stolen into a sanctuary reclaimed. The weeks after her legal victory were filled with labor, intention, and a kind of personal rebuilding that reached deeper than the renovation of old walls and faded furniture. What Margaret was truly reconstructing was herself, not the obedient, invisible woman who had once tolerated subtle cruelties under the guise of family, but the woman who had discovered her own voice, her own power, and had used both to take back what was hers. Asterisk, but restoration, Margaret learned, did not guarantee peace. Justice had been served. Yes, the deed was back in her name. The house had been returned. Her efforts to turn the basement into a safe space for other displaced women were taking shape. Yet beneath that, progress, like a quiet storm building on the horizon, was the looming reality that Nathan and Claire had not spoken a single word since the court ruling. No apology, no explanation, no closure. Asterisk, that silence unnerved her far more than she wanted to admit. It felt less like distance and more like erasure, as if she had been exiled from their lives completely, deemed too inconvenient or too dangerous to keep around. Claire had always been calculated, cold beneath her polished charm. Nathan had grown into that mold gradually, almost imperceptibly, and that was what hurt the most. His transformation wasn't a sudden betrayal. It had been a slow erosion of the boy she once held in her arms, and now, that boy, her only child, was unreachable. Asterisk, she tried not to dwell on it, but sometimes at night, when the house grew quiet and her own breath became the only sound in the room, the weight of that abandonment pressed down on her. How could a son, her son, leave her at a station like lost luggage and never look back? Asterisk, but as with everything in Margaret's life, pain eventually gave way to purpose. Asterisk, one Tuesday morning, she received a call from Lucille. A woman named April, in her late 50s, had come to the shelter after fleeing a physically abusive marriage. She had no place to go, no family, and no financial security. Margaret didn't hesitate. She had prepared Sunbeam Haven for exactly this, for women like her, like herself. Asterisk, April arrived that afternoon, shoulders tense, eyes wary. Margaret greeted her at the door with warm tea and a soft quilt folded neatly across one arm. April barely spoke at first. Trauma had locked her in silence. But Margaret understood that silence. She had worn it herself once like a second skin. Asterisk, in the following days, April began to settle in. She helped around the house, cooked meals, and sat quietly with Margaret in the evenings, sipping tea and listening to the classical music that played softly from the kitchen radio. They never talked about their wounds directly. They didn't need to. The understanding between them ran deeper than words. Asterisk, one evening, as they folded laundry together, April finally asked, "Do you ever think they'll come back, your family?" Asterisk, Margaret paused, the towel in her hand half folded. "Sometimes I hope they won't," she said truthfully. "Because if they come back, it means I have to decide whether to forgive, and I don't know if I can." Asterisk, April looked down, her voice soft. "I think forgiveness is harder when you never got an apology." Asterisk, "That's the thing," Margaret said. "I'm not even sure I want the apology anymore. I just want them to know I survived without them, that I'm not the person they thought they could discard." Asterisk, April nodded. "That's powerful." Asterisk, they continued folding in silence, to women bound not by blood, but by understanding, by a shared journey from invisibility to defiance. Asterisk, days passed, and with each one, Margaret found herself growing stronger. She hosted a Sunday brunch for a group of elderly women from the neighborhood. Women she'd known in passing but never spoken with deeply. They laughed together, shared recipes, and told stories of their youth. One of them, a retired teacher named Dolores, had lost her son to addiction and had been raising her grandson alone. Another, Barbara, had spent years caring for a husband with Alzheimer's and was now learning how to live alone for the first time. They shared their stories like offerings at a sacred altar, and in return, Margaret offered her home, a place where their voices mattered. As the house grew warmer with community, Margaret noticed the contrast more and more, the vibrancy of strangers who cared, against the cold absence of her own kin. And then, without warning, the silence was broken. It was a Wednesday when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Margaret had just finished watering the garden when she heard the chime. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door, expecting a delivery or perhaps Lucille. Instead, she found Eva. The girl had grown taller, her curly brown hair pulled back in a loose braid. She wore a light jacket and held a small backpack. Her eyes wide, unsure, and shimmering met Margaret's, and in them, Margaret saw both herself and the child she used to cradle. Eva, she whispered, her voice cracking. Hi, Grandma, Eva said quietly. Can I come in? Margaret stepped aside, too stunned to speak. Eva walked in slowly, looking around, taking it all in, the repainted walls, the familiar photographs now reframed, the lavender on the windowsill. She set her backpack down on the couch and turned to her grandmother. I don't know if I was supposed to come, she said, her voice trembling. Mom doesn't know I'm here. Neither does Dad. Margaret moved closer, reaching out gently. Are you okay? Eva nodded, tears forming in her eyes. I got your letter. It came through a friend of mine at school. I don't know how. I think Dad was trying to make sure I didn't see it, but I did. I kept it hidden. Margaret's breath caught. I wasn't sure if you'd ever read it. I read it 100 times, Eva said, and I remembered everything. The stories, the cookies, the songs you used to sing. I don't know why they did what they did. I don't understand them. But I remember how you made me feel. And I missed you. Margaret pulled her into a tight embrace. Eva sobbed against her shoulder, and Margaret let herself cry too. The pain of lost years, of broken trust, of stolen memories, it all poured out in that moment. And in its place, something new took root. Later, over warm soup and bread. Eva explained that things at home had changed since the court case. Her parents rarely spoke of Margaret, and when they did, it was with bitterness. Claire had grown colder, more controlling. Nathan was distant, emotionally vacant. Eva had begun to see the cracks, not just in their story, but in their behavior. She knew something wasn't right. I'm not here to take sides, she said softly, but I needed to see for myself. I needed to remember who you are, not just what they told me. Margaret reached across the table and held her hand. You're always welcome here, always. Eva stayed the night, sleeping in the guest room with a stuffed bear she'd retrieved from the basement, one Margaret had kept safe just in case. The next morning, they made pancakes together, just like they used to. For those few hours, it was as if time had stitched itself back together, not perfectly, but with enough strength to hold. When Eva left that afternoon, promising to return soon, Margaret stood on the porch, watching her walk down the street. Her heart ached, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Eva had come back, and she had come on her own. That night, Margaret lit a candle in the window, not as a plea, not as a prayer, but as a signal that her home, her story, and her strength were still burning bright, and that the door was open to those who came in love, not entitlement. She had fought the battle, she had reclaimed her dignity, and now she was beginning to see that healing wasn't just about getting back what was lost, it was about discovering what you never knew you still had. Margaret woke to the golden warmth of sunlight pouring through the lace curtains in her bedroom, the kind she hadn't seen in years, not just because the window faced east, but because for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to sleep with the curtains open, unafraid of the outside world. For so long, her life had been one of defense, of closing things off, of hiding her heart behind smiles and silence. But now, with the quiet return of her granddaughter Eva and the gentle rhythm of healing, she had found a strange, unfamiliar comfort, peace. Downstairs, the house stirred to life with a familiar hum. April, who had become more than just a guest at Sunbeam Haven, was already in the kitchen brewing tea and humming an old hymn. The scent of baking muffins filled the air, Margaret's recipe, now shared and evolving. The women who had once arrived at her door with haunted eyes were slowly transforming too. April now helped manage the space, taking responsibility with care and kindness. Another woman, Denise, a widow who had fled a financially abusive son, had arrived only last week. Margaret saw in her the same brokenness she herself had once carried. But Denise had already started smiling again. Margaret moved through her morning routine with ease. Her movements were slower now, but not from weakness, from mindfulness. Each step, each task was deliberate. She paused to water the lavender on the windowsill, adjusted the picture frame with the photo of her husband, and added a new note to the corkboard in the hallway where every resident left messages of gratitude or hope. It had started as a simple idea, but the board had grown into a living journal of healing. Today, she wrote, even the strongest trees bend in the wind, but they do not break. Later that morning, Margaret sat in the backyard garden she'd revived over the last month. What was once an overgrown patch of weeds had blossomed into a peaceful refuge, rows of herbs, bursts of daisies, small vegetables starting to take root. A wooden bench near the fence had become her favorite spot. It was there, she reflected, often with tea in hand, letting memories rise and settle like silt at the bottom of a stream. She thought of Nathan again. Though Ava's visit had brought her immeasurable joy, the absence of her son remained a thorn, lodged in her soul. Not because she longed for his affection that had faded over time, but because she still couldn't understand how the boy she raised had turned into a man who could erase her so completely. She had given him everything, her time, her labor, her love, and in return, he had traded her presence for convenience. She had been tempted, more than once, to write to him, not to seek forgiveness or offer it, but to say what needed to be said. Yet each time she sat down to compose the letter, her hand froze. There were no words that could translate betrayal into closure. That afternoon, she received another letter, this time not from Eva, but from someone else entirely. The envelope was formal, printed with the logo of Nathan's workplace, a high-profile financial consulting firm downtown. Inside, a terse, typed letter awaited her. Greater than Mrs. Ellison. We are writing to inform you that Nathan Ellison is currently on a leave of absence from his position. We have received notice that legal actions against him now resolved are a matter of public record. We kindly request no further correspondence be directed to his workplace. Sincerely, HR Department. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. There was no anger in her chest, only a deep, hollow sadness. It seemed Nathan had gone into hiding from more than just her, perhaps from himself. She sat for a long time after that, her thoughts drifting like leaves on a pond. Eventually, April found her there and quietly joined her on the bench. You okay? She asked softly. Margaret looked up, her face tired but calm. I think so. Sometimes I wonder if justice is ever really enough. April nodded, understanding immediately. It isn't, she said. Justice gives you closure, but it doesn't give you the people back. Margaret sighed. Exactly. They sat in silence for a while, birds chirping in the branches overhead. Finally, April said, you gave me more than just a roof, Margaret. You gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Safety. The kind of safety that lets you dream again. Margaret blinked back tears. That's all I wanted to do, for anyone who came through this door. April smiled. Well, you did it. The next day, Margaret received a message from Eva. A text this time, short and hesitant. Greater than hi Grandma. Can I come over this weekend? I want to bring something. Margaret replied within seconds. Greater than, of course, my sunbeam. You are always welcome. On Saturday, Eva arrived wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, carrying a small duffel bag and a wrapped gift. Her eyes lit up when she saw the garden. Wow, she said. It's beautiful. I remember when you used to grow basil and tomatoes. The smell is exactly the same. Margaret hugged her tight. It remembers you too. They spent the day baking cookies and watching old movies, just like they used to. Margaret noticed how Eva had grown, not just in height, but in soul. There was something wise behind her eyes, something tempered by the turmoil she had witnessed. At home. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eva handed her the wrapped gift. I made this, she said, for the house. Margaret carefully peeled back the paper and gasped. It was a hand-painted sign on a piece of reclaimed wood. In swirling letters, it read, Greater than Sunbeam Haven, a place to begin again. Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. She traced the letters with her fingers, overwhelmed by the love and symbolism embedded in the gift. It's perfect, she finally whispered. Eva smiled. I thought the name deserves something official. They hung it together the next morning, above the entrance to the basement. The letters gleamed in the morning light, casting a warm shadow on the doorway. It felt like a ribbon-cutting ceremony of the spirit. The space had been blessed, not by fanfare, but by sincerity. That evening, as Margaret walked through the house, she paused by the old photo wall she had restored. Pictures of her and her husband, of Nathan as a child, of Eva as a toddler. There were gaps, blank spaces where other photos had once hung. Moments she no longer needed to display. Memories that no longer comforted her. Instead, she planned to add something new. Photos of April, of Denise, of the women who now called her home their sanctuary. This was her family now, not born of blood, but of shared strength and resilience. That night, as the women of Sunbeam Haven sat around the table, April, Denise, Lucille, Eva, and Margaret, they ate, laughed, and shared stories under the soft glow of pendant lights. The food was simple, the company richer than any banquet Margaret had ever attended. There was no grand speech, no ceremonial toast, but there was a moment, quiet, unspoken, when every woman at the table understood they were not broken, they were rebuilding. Margaret caught Ava's eye across the table and gave her a knowing smile. And for the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, Margaret Ellison no longer felt like a survivor of betrayal. She felt like the founder of something beautiful, something lasting. Something stronger than the pain that had once tried to silence her. And in that house, her house, there would always be room for one more. The house that once echoed with abandonment, now thrummed with life. Margaret Ellison stood at the top of her staircase, watching the gentle flow of activity unfold below her. Laughter floated up from the kitchen, where April was showing Denise how to make rosemary scones. The faint notes of Ava's guitar strummed through the open living room, and the smell of cinnamon drifted on the air. It was Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet, perfect Sunday Margaret had never thought she'd know again. Downstairs, a new woman, Leela, had joined Sunbeam Haven just a few days ago. She was only 45, quiet, thin, with eyes that looked far older. Her ex-husband had drained her finances and spirit alike, and she had arrived with a single bag and a silence so deep it frightened even the others. But today, she had smiled, a small smile, yes, but real. Margaret had seen it during breakfast, and that alone made her feel as though she had won a private war against darkness. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, pausing to straighten the framed sign Eva had made. Sunbeam Haven, a place to begin. Again, it now hung in the front hallway, where every woman who entered would see it first. She thought back to the day she stood alone on the train platform, clutching a crushed paper bag of cookies, believing she had been discarded completely. That day seemed like a lifetime ago. In truth, it had only been a few months. But the woman who stood there now was entirely different, forged by loss, tempered by justice, and renewed by community. As she reached the bottom step, Eva looked up from the couch and grinned. Hey, Grandma, want to hear something I've been working on? Margaret smiled. Always. Eva began strumming gently, her voice soft but clear. The lyrics were about home, not the walls and roof kind, but the kind built from kindness, strength, and forgiveness. Margaret listened with her heart wide open, each word another balm over the years of quiet pain she had endured. She saw April's eyes grow misty. Denise rested her hand over her heart. Even Leela, perched at the edge of the armchair, tilted her head as though allowing the music to loosen a part of her soul she hadn't accessed in years. When the final note faded into the warm hum of the home, there was a beat of silence. Then came the applause, soft, reverent, healing. Eva beamed. Margaret reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. You have a gift, she said, and not just for music, for reaching people. Eva blushed and shrugged. I guess I get that from you. The words landed softly but powerfully. Margaret's eyes welled, not from sadness, but from recognition. For so long, she had wondered whether she had left anything behind in her son's world, any legacy, any imprint. Now she realized she had left the best parts of herself in Eva, Asterisk later that evening, as the sky turned lavender and the wind rustled through the leaves in her garden, Margaret sat on the back porch wrapped in a shawl. Her mug of chamomile tea steamed gently in the cool air. She watched as Eva and April planted daffodil bulbs in the flower beds. Eva had insisted on planting something bright, so the house smiles in spring. Asterisk Margaret marveled at how this home, once a place of heartbreak, had become a sanctuary. She never intended to build a community. She only wanted a place to grieve. But life, she realized, had a habit of blooming in places you least expected. Asterisk as the planting wrapped up, April came and sat beside her. Asterisk, you thinking about him? She asked gently. No need to say Nathan's name. Asterisk Margaret nodded. Sometimes. Less than I used to. But yes. Asterisk April took a slow sip from her own mug. Think you'll always carry him, in one way or another, doesn't mean he gets to define you. Asterisk Margaret looked up at the moon, just beginning to rise. I know, but some nights I wonder what I did wrong. Asterisk April shook her head. You didn't do anything wrong. You just expected love to behave like a promise when it behaves more like a mirror. Sometimes, people don't like what they see in it, and they walk away. The truth of that settled into Margaret's chest like a sigh. That night, after dinner and tea and stories by the fire, Margaret retreated to her room and opened her journal, a habit she had picked up again. She flipped back through the pages, reading entries filled with fear, resolve, anger, and eventually, peace. Tonight, she wrote, greater than today, I watched my granddaughter plant flowers in the same soil I once cried into. I sat beside women who were once strangers and now feel like sisters. I drank tea in a home I built twice, once with my husband, and again with my grief, but the second time, I built it for me. Asterisk, I still think of Nathan. Maybe I always will, but today, he didn't consume me. That's growth. Asterisk, greater than this house, is no longer a monument to what I lost. It's a monument to what I found. Strength, sisterhood, and self. Asterisk. She closed the journal and looked around her room. It no longer felt like a museum of memories. It was alive. The curtains swayed in the breeze. A photo of her, Eva, and April sat on the dresser, the kind of photo she used to dream of when she felt forgotten. Now, it was real. Asterisk. The next morning brought a surprise. As Margaret prepared breakfast, the doorbell rang. Lucille stood on the porch with a large manila envelope and a big smile. Asterisk, this came to the shelter by mistake, she said. Figured I'd bring it over myself. Asterisk Margaret invited her in and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a legal document, stamped and signed. It was a notarized letter from Nathan's attorney. Asterisk, greater than dear Mrs. Ellison. Asterisk, my client, Nathan Ellison, wishes to formally relinquish any claims or future interest in the property located at 74 Oak Ridge Lane. He further states that he recognizes the distress caused and takes full legal and emotional responsibility for his previous actions. While he does not request reconciliation, he asks that this letter be accepted as acknowledgement of wrongdoing and final closure. Sincerely, Jonathan M. Blake, Attorney at Law. Asterisk, Margaret read the letter 3 times. Each time, her reaction changed. First came shock, then skepticism, and finally, stillness. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. A closing of a door she had long assumed would stay forever ajar. No apologies. No explanations, just acknowledgement. And oddly enough, that was enough. Asterisk, she looked at Lucille, who waited silently. It doesn't change anything, Margaret said. Asterisk, Lucille smiled. No, but it means you don't have to carry it anymore. Asterisk, Margaret folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't frame it, didn't burn it, just stored it. Like any document no longer needed in day-to-day life, but important enough to keep, just in case. Asterisk, the days that followed were filled with light and laughter. The garden grew. Sunbeam Haven welcomed to more women. Margaret taught a baking class at the shelter. Eva returned each weekend, bringing music and stories. Life had become a series of small joys stitched together into a blanket she wrapped around herself with pride. Asterisk, one evening, while sitting under the stars with Eva beside her, Margaret asked, do you think you'll ever forgive them, your parents? Asterisk, Eva was quiet for a long time. I don't know. I think forgiveness is less about them and more about me. I don't want to carry their choices forever. I want to grow past them. Asterisk, Margaret smiled. Then you're already on your way. Asterisk, and with that, they leaned back on the garden bench, looking up at a sky so wide, it made even past wounds feel small. Asterisk, Margaret had come full circle, not to the woman she once was, but to someone even stronger. She had been left at a station, discarded like a burden, but she had returned with a court order. Yes, and so much more. She had returned with dignity, with purpose, with a legacy no one could ever erase. She had built not just a house, but a haven, and in that haven, healing bloomed, quietly, steadily, beautifully, and always, always in her own name.